Hello and welcome to the IdeaCast interview series, episode number 124. My guest in this episode is Professor Tom Gilbert, and Tom is the director of the Danish National Research Foundation Center for Evolutionary Hologenomics. He's also the group leader of the hologenomics group at the Globe Institute. And we're going to find out about hologenomics, how it relates to evolution, holobionts, symbionts, and a whole bunch of other things. It was just discovering what hologenomics were and found Professor Gilbert, and he was kind enough to come on and have a conversation with me, and I'm grateful for that. So I hope this is a good and informative conversation for you, and I appreciate you being here. Thanks. I'd like to welcome Professor Tom Gilbert to the IdeaCast interview series, and we're going into a territory that is virgin territory for me. I've done a little research on Tom's work and some of his associates, and so I'm looking forward to learning some things today. Tom, welcome. It's good to have you
Thank
here,
you.
sir.
Thanks for
And
having me.
I'm grateful to have you here. Yeah, I reached out to you. I was like, I hope he responds and was willing to come on for a conversation. And you were, and I appreciate that because I think my audience, which I think when we had our pre-meet, my folks that subscribe are cognitive science, psychology, and philosophy of mind. But we can move around in other spaces, and I'm sure they will find it fulfilling and informative. So, but on that subject, if maybe we could open up and you could tell us about hologenomics, maybe the provenance story, what led you to be prominent in the field, and we'll go from there.
Well, the last bit's easy to answer. There are very few of us.
Yeah,
So
wasn't a high climb, right?
that solves that problem. But no, I'm an evolutionary biologist by training. I'm in particular a molecular evolutionary biologist. So for like 20 odd years, what I would do is sequence DNA or RNA from various organisms and use it to understand evolution. And if, for example, you said to me, Tom, how does a vulture eat a rotting carcass? Why doesn't it die? What I would do is sequence its genome, look at what genes it has, how they differ to other birds, and then look for an explanation. Okay, it's got genes that makes its immune system strong or gastric system strong, right? So very much find an answer in a genome to a question like that, and it could be a bird or a plant or whatever, even a pathogen sometimes. Um, but my doing so and my focusing on the big organism basically reflects a should we say an error on my part because I was never really a microbiologist, right? Often in biology, people separate quite early into microbiologists and organismal biologists, and we have very little to do with each other outside of the context of sickness, right?
Hmm.
And so I didn't really pay attention to the microbes. I knew they were important. They obviously digest your food and they're useful for us if we want to drink beer or eat bread or that kind of thing. But I didn't really give them another thought. But then about 10 years or so, I actually met a man called Gary Graves, who's a bird expert from the Smithsonian's Natural History Museum in DC. And he actually knew I was interested in birds and genomes and what was going on. And he came to me and said, Tom, can you do a project with me where I'm going to get vultures and I'm actually going to collect all the stuff on their face and in their stomach and on their legs. And I'm like, why would you want to do that, Gary? And Gary's like, well, it's fascinating. I mean, think about it. These things are eating rotting carcasses by sticking their heads inside them and pulling them apart. I'm being covered in all sorts of nasty stuff. And sure, you guys can look at the genome and say why the vulture doesn't die when it does that. But isn't it just fascinating what they're bathing in and what they're eating? And I was intrigued at this, and I actually then took my first dive into microbe-related stuff. I collaborated with some microbiologists, and basically what we did was we looked at what microbes are on the face and in the stomach of these vultures, right? And unsurprisingly, we found the microbes you find there are the kind of things you'd associate with a rotting carcass, because that's what they're eating and bathing. But the funny thing was, as part of the study, we had the chance to get some vultures from the zoo in Copenhagen. And these are vultures that have never bathed in a nasty rotting carcass, right? They've never eaten rotting meat. But when you look at the microbes on their faces, what we call the microbiomes of their faces and their gut, it was basically the same as the wild ones. And this was weird to me. I was like, hold on, we're assuming they get these nasty microbes from the carcasses. And yet these zoo vultures that were born from zoo vultures that were born from zoo vultures are so far removed from your rotting carcass. have got the same microbes, right? And in biology, typically when you see something that doesn't make sense, it means you're not really appreciating that it should make sense. So we thought about it a bit, and this got me and my colleagues interested in the only reason we think these microbes must be there is they must be doing something. It's not just a result of the dinner. They must be somehow adding to the life of the vulture. Otherwise, why would it maintain it through the generations? And so actually, we then got more into this and we did analyses on the microbes. And the take home was, yes, these microbes that originally did derive from rotting carcasses are actually serving a purpose. They're producing things on the face and in the body of the vulture to kind of protect it from the poisons they take in. And what this basically showed me very, very late, I would think, in my career, although still very few people think about it this way, is going back to that original question, how does a vulture survive eating rotten food? Yes, the genome has an answer. It has genes that do stuff, but it's also got these associated microbes that it absolutely has to have to do it. And without both parts, it's not there. So every answer I was coming up with before this realization was at best incomplete, was at worst completely wrong, right? Because we'd forgotten these things. And this is really what hologenomics is. And my center, Evolutionary Hologenomics, is my logo I'm wearing for this Center for Evolutionary Hologenomics, is studying evolution through the hologenomic window, that is the genomes of the host and the microbe. Today, we tend to realize that microbes are so important to host that we call them holobionts. And you know, you are a holobiont, a plant is a holobiont because it needs both bits. And the hologenome is the genetic basis of that. And really what we're interested in is how do the two parts work together? If you assume they work together, how does that change how you think about how life works and what bigger picture consequences are there?
With regard to the vulture, I'm trying to imagine circuits of life, and you're looking at an animal that is eating these very toxic microbes, but they're essentially performing the same task inside the vulture that they would be doing consuming the protein on there. So it kind of makes sense intuitively. And I actually got curious about vulture morphology, and I was wondering why they're mostly not feathered from their necks up. And that makes sense. They're intruding on,
They're
spaces of
burying their head in rotten carcass.
yeah, exactly. So the feathers, it's messy. We can shed that appendage there. So, but that speaks to an interesting. You touch on this in other species, how that process got started, and the inoculation process, and then the sort of symbiotic relationship between those microbes and the animal. So that's a deep time biology there, or a deep time evolutionary process. And I know you use canids, and you speak to our companion dogs that are around us and ubiquitous in human culture, and that speaks to another kind of inoculation process, or another kind of developmental process with respect to a holobiont and the assemblage of the microorganisms that facilitate certain things. And I found that to be a fascinating story. So if you're interested in sharing that with us, a theory of yours, and
Oh,
when we're done with that, I do want to. There's something else I want to open up both for vultures and dogs, but let's bring that story in too, because it gives us another aspect to this.
sure. I mean, if we take back a step, I mean, microbes are everywhere, right? But fundamentally, just because you are surrounded by microbes or eating microbes doesn't mean they will successfully live inside you. Some will maybe infect you and make you very bad. Some will go straight through, but some will form an association with you, right? And we're actually very interested in what within a host determines which microbes succeed and work with you versus which ones can't live inside, right? There are some microbes, for example, probably down in deep sea vents, haven't got a chance in hell living inside your body. We're so not compatible, right? But there are other microbes where if you met them, which you may not every day, but if you did meet them, they could come inside you, right? And there's a tight interaction between the two. And just to go back to your vulture point, clearly at some stage in evolution, the vulture genome had to change in a way to allow it to live and tolerate these certain microbes from the toxic carcass, and there would be a co-evolution of the two. Now, I am very interested in both what in the genome, both the conventional genome, but other mechanisms as well, determine which microbes could live inside different organisms, whether it's different species or even different individuals, just you and me, for example. And if we know what this is, and if we can identify differences in which microbes can live inside you versus me, or an animal versus another animal, how does that actually change evolutionary adaptive potential? So the example you're alluding to with dogs is an idea I have. I can't say it's proven. I can't say it's hugely popular, but my theory is based along this thinking. So wolves are a majestic wild creature, not very easy to be around as a human. You know, they're fine as puppies, but as they get older, they're just a dangerous wild animal, right? I mean, no matter how you look at it, they're not an animal you'd put your baby next to and leave it and go away, right? And yet we've domesticated them into dogs, fine, right? And if you compare the genome of a wolf and the genome of a dog, you can find lots of genetic differences that are different between the two of them. And they're in genes. And if you look at what these genes do, they often affect the nervous system. And this makes sense because you change the behavior on the wolf by selecting on it. And that explains today why you can put a baby next to most dogs and it's fine, right? They've got these accumulated series of mutations in certain genes. Super. But what I always found really interesting is that's the end of quite a long process of repeated selection over many generations. How did our forefathers and foremothers and whoever it was 25 plus thousand years ago survive the initial generations? You don't just get a wolf, find a puppy, it's magically got this whole series of changes and bingo, it grows up as a dog, right?
Hmm.
It's an extremely slow process. And I can't imagine anything harder than living alongside a wolf for many generations, you know, and it not eating your baby. So there's a little bit of a paradox here, right, that I think is overlooked. And this is what I found very interesting, because if you start thinking hologenomics now, why is that relevant? Well, what we need to solve this problem is a rapid behavioral change, right? And one of the amazing things that people have documented that gut microbes do in particular to animals is they produce certain metabolites that can have an amazingly large and serious effect on the behavior of the animal, right? I mean, you can, for example, take a mouse and make it very aggressive or very docile by just switching its gut microbes. This is not a matter of time. You don't have to wait many generations. You just literally switch its microbes, right? Why they do this? Well, they're just basically pumping out chemicals. I mean, you know, the bacteria eat stuff, they pump out metabolites. What is it happens when you take a medicine? You're taking metabolites often made by microbes in a factory, right? So they're a little tiny drug factory inside the gut. Now, why is this relevant? Well, if I had a wolf and I really needed to change its behavior very fast today, I would basically try and switch its its gut microbiome, right? I mean, I'd either give it drugs directly, or I'd naturally change its gut microbiome for microbes that would produce metabolites that would basically have the same effect, right? Now, I'm not saying our forefathers did this, but if we imagine a situation where wolves are living alongside humans, they're getting closer and closer, maybe because they're running out of natural prey to eat, because we know wolves used to eat large herbivores and they become rare towards the end of the Pleistocene. They start scavenging around humans, maybe, because what do humans do apart from leave rubbish everywhere? Leave half-eaten bones and feces. My guess is either the wolves started scavenging on human feces and human food remains and started modifying their gut microbiome and their behavior. Or, as humans are, we probably killed the wolves, found the cute little babies. Babies are always attractive, brought the babies in, but by simply raising the baby wolves with humans, maybe not with any long-term purpose, you know, they lick a human, they eat the feces, whatever, then you're changing their gut microbiome, right? And in that case, that switching gut microbiome could have switched the behavior, in which case we've now got a drugged wolf that we can live alongside, in which case we now have an animal that we can select on its genome for many, many generations without it eating our babies, right? And it may sound crazy, but there's a few things that are key here. Firstly, yes, microbes can have a big effect on behavior, including in dogs. People who compare the microbiome of feral dogs with aggressive behavior and tame dogs often find significant differences, right? Two, if you do similar experiments on very controlled animal sets where you keep everything constant except the behavior, this can be done on rats, it can be done on chickens, we've done it on foxes, you see again behavioral differences linked to the microbiome. Three, what do dogs love to eat? Human feces. It sounds disgusting, but a dog in a park will make a beeline for human feces, right? So to me, it's not actually insane. And if this is the case, then it's an example of how the domestication itself had to leverage on this relationship of the gut microbiome and the wolf, right? And the human. But that then raises another question you might be thinking, which is humans lived alongside wolves for a long time, 25,000 years ago, domesticated them. We lived alongside related canids like African golden wolves, Ethiopian wolves, dholes, jackals for much, much longer. Why did we never domesticate them? Surely they were in a situation of approaching humans, maybe eating feces. Why didn't their behavior change? Was it because we didn't need them? Maybe, but to be honest, if I'm a hunter-gatherer in Africa, I'd love to have an animal to keep the lions away at night, right, and to help hunt. Or could it be that even though the microbes were there, genetically the jackal or the African golden wolf wasn't compatible with them? So if you fed them to the animal, instead of forming a relationship inside it and affecting its brain, it just passes straight through it. Just like,
Mm.
for example, if I fed you deep sea microbes, right? So maybe not only is the microbe driving the behavioral change or facilitating it, but it has to be compatible with the animal itself, its genome to work. And if that is the case, it actually limits what can happen in a lot of situations, right? So maybe, for example, I mean, we have vultures, as we started with, eating rotten carcasses because maybe genetically they could tolerate certain microbes, but maybe another bird, let's say a parrots. If parrots fundamentally can't tolerate those rotting carcass microbes at all, they would never be able to start the process. You wouldn't have scavenging parrots, right? Or vampire bats, they live obligate living off blood, right? They require some combination and collaboration between the genome and the microbiome. But could all bats do that if you go back far enough in time, or is it only certain types of bats that are genetically pre-adapted towards it? So,
Mm.
what are the potentials? What are the possibilities? What are the limitations?
I'm almost wondering if you could go and test your theory about the other canids and inoculating, and I don't know if there's an ethical boundary here, but inoculating jackals or whatever with a microbiome that associates with cellulose digestion, which I think in researching your work that carbohydrates and plant fibers and things like that tend to have the capacity and that gut brain access to produce the neurochemicals, the neuropeptides or whatever that plug into our receptor sites and keep us on a kind of affective keel, clean keel.
I mean, absolutely, in theory, absolutely possible. And even simpler than that, you could, in theory, simply take a mother dog and give her jackal puppies and see what happens.
Okay.
And see if they
Ah,
just pick it up from the mother, right? And see if they not only pick them up, but they maintain them through life. Ethically, permits, whole nother thing.
yeah.
But I mean, these kind of cross-fostering experiments or essentially micro-transplant experiments are, in theory, very doable. People do it all the time on mice in labs, for example, right? I mean, it's not 100% straightforward, but it could be done. Uh, Permit-wise, whole nother issue.
Right. And I'm also wondering if at that time that the interaction and domestication of the particular species of wolves that we later became dogs, if our diets were different. So if we were transient in Africa, maybe more protein than plant fiber. I don't know. I don't know what we were scavenging on or eating back then, but maybe our diet constituency would, there was that golden hour in 12,000 years ago before the Younger Dryas or whatever that we had that more plant-based, more cellulose, microbiome compatible digestive system.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is the fascinating thing. It is a very much a multi-way axis because you've got the genome, the microbiome, but then the environment and the source of microbes themselves, right? So if the microbes aren't present in the environment, or if the environment itself is not correct, you're lacking those key inputs, right? So it is a really fascinating mixture of them all, and it's very complex. I mean,
Mm,
exactly what goes on is not easy, but what we really like to do is think about possibilities, alternate. I mean, whether to be honest, this happened or not, what we're trying to show is it could have happened, right? I mean,
right.
we don't have a time machine, we can't get back in time. Even if it was the case in dogs, dogs were domesticated probably at least twice. Maybe it wasn't in both of them. If it is in dogs, what about rabbits? I mean, there are many options, but at least to me, the beauty of hologenome thinking is it just gives us a whole alternate way to think about many things. Possibly we're wrong. I mean, we're wrong, right? But at least we can get some new ideas out there because a lot of
Yeah.
science is doing the same thing and tweaking on it and tweaking on it, which is
Yeah.
fine, very important. But sometimes it's nice to think outside the box, right? And say if we're wrong, we're wrong. But at
Mhm.
least we can speculate on it and try and do experiments to see if it's compatible with it.
Yeah, and I would think that if people are being good scientists or philosophers of science, that the Darwinian model shouldn't be inviolate. It shouldn't be this ensconced thing that never, that's fully reified and never changes, you know. That kind of speaks against the whole principle of evolution. So again, your ideas that you're putting forward, I think, and that will be a segue in a moment to some questions I have for you regarding your project, the theses that are in there, and how conventional science is receiving it. But I wanted to ask, oh, like you mentioned in a conversation, I think you mentioned the belly of foxes too, the Soviet. I don't know what his background was, but he would basically, in so many generations, he was able to get phenotypes of foxes that were cute, fuzzy little things that you don't mind having around the house. And was there diet influence, dietary influence that led to that, other than his just selecting for? Do you think there was an involvement in that as
But
well?
it's definitely a great question. I mean, the Belyaev foxes, so Belyaev in Novosibirsk in the late 50s starts his experiment, and it has been retrospectively, the experiment itself has not been criticized, but people have basically complained a bit about it because Belyaev selected on them for tameness, and later actually he started for aggression. And he reported very quickly changes happened, not just in the behavior, but interestingly, all sorts of other traits that we associate with domestics, like coat color and
Mm.
ear position and tail and voice, right? And and it was amazing. It was like, wow, look how fast these things happen. The criticism has been that actually he was working on foxes he got from fur farms that were therefore semi-tamed. They're at
Mm.
least used to living in that and so on. So they're not purely wild. But
Hmm.
ignoring that, he still sees these changes. Now, what is fascinating from the context of my hypothesis is these foxes are meant to have been raised in identical conditions the whole time, both the tame and the aggressive ones, fed the same food. The food
Mm.
might vary through time, but the foxes all get the same food every time. There's no dietary difference. It's not like the tame ones get kibble and the wild ones get like zombie or something, right? It's the
Yeah.
same thing. And so they're in the same environment, they're getting the same food, they're receiving the same bombardment of microbes the whole time. And yet, when we sequenced, and we here, Lara, who was a former PhD student of mine, when she sequenced the gut content of these, and when another student, Louisa, analyzed it further, they saw that although the microbes in the two lines' guts are very similar, there are small but significant differences. And when you look at the differences, you see they are to do with genes encoding in the microbes things that make sense in the context of the nervous system, for example, butyrate production or glutamate production or and so what this seems to be pointing at is they're being bombarded with the same cloud of microbes, but somehow something in the bodies of the two fox lines is differentially selecting on them in slightly different ways. So you get slightly different community in the tame and the aggressive. And those microbial communities have got slightly different genes that are having an effect on the metabolites processed. And then it becomes very tempting to say, well, that then suggests, yes, the behavior is at least being partly driven by these differences in the microbes, therefore fitting my hypothesis. Right now, the next question, of course, is why are they varying, right? And I assume there's really only two reasons for it. One would be that something about the physiology of the fox is causing it. Maybe just the stressful conditions of the aggressive one is having an effect. But then the question is why? And again, that probably comes back to genetics. So small genetic differences in the genome of the tame and the aggressive foxes must be affecting the body in some way. That is then affecting the microbes. That is then having a knock-on on the behavior, right? And so Belyaev, by selecting on behavior, is really selecting on something that's affecting the gut microbiome to affect the behavior.
Okay.
And just a very quick last point on that. There was a very nice study done by a lady called Anna Kukova in Illinois and Goji Zhang. They sequenced the genomes of the two fox lines, and they actually find after whatever 40, 50 generations, many differences in the genomes between the tame and the aggressive line. And their paper is full of lots of examples of genes that affect the nervous system, which is what you'd expect, right?
Hmm.
But actually, there's a tiny little bit in the paper that says, oh, the immune system is also different, right?
Ah. Mm.
And to me, that's like, okay, that to me seems to be maybe the key thing, right? Maybe
Yeah.
the very first thing they selected on was the immune system to
Hmm.
change the microbiome, and everything else came later. I mean, I would love to be able to test that somehow, but
Yeah.
at least it shows this interaction of the two having an effect. And the microbiome is not on its own, it's being conditioned by the genome. But by focusing on that angle, we're not looking at the nervous system at all directly. It's a whole different thing that suddenly could be important.
Yeah. That immune system is mediating and gatekeeping the facilitation or the enabling of those microbiome to exist respectively in each of the phenotypes, if you will. Oh, that's fascinating. And something else I thought was interesting is you referenced a Virginia Tech article, and they were raising chickens of varying morphological states, sizes and things. And I think, and you can steer me right on this, the enteric system, the presence of certain bacteria or microflora were in different parts of the enteric system, which seems to have also some kind of mediating or remediating influence on, in this case, morphology, but maybe other things as well.
No, I mean, absolutely. It's a fascinating study. It's this long-term selection on chickens for size. And they have these crazy two different size dependence. I forget the size difference, but it's massive.
Yeah, it was big. Yeah.
It's crazy. Yeah, I'm not sure the figures even to scale because the difference is so big.
No, one was a few
but yeah,
grams, just a few grams. Yeah, the one chicken.
and it wasn't
Anyway.
that long, right? And the fascinating thing for me when I read that was, yes, exactly. They see that firstly, no matter where they look in the intestine, they actually cut it in different places. There are differences in the microbes present, right? And but then they're also seeing differences in the genome, and then they're actually invoking certain genetic genome changes with certain microbial differences, and essentially saying, look, this size difference is at least partly coming from selection on genes that are affecting the microbes, which makes sense because what is the gut microbe doing? But of course, affecting how good you are at digesting food, right?
Yeah.
And again, I mean, it doesn't go to the extent of showing the full thing, but it makes a lot of sense that, again, it's selection on the genome for the microbes. They're that missing intermediate. And again, this is kind of where the hologenomic, the holobiont thing comes back to, like how many of our phenotypes, our traits of interest in humans in life are not a direct thing on our body, but indirect via the gut microbiome or the skin microbiome or whatever. And to me, I say that's really fascinating. And you can, once you actually start to appreciate the range of effects the microbiome can have on an animal, it really starts blowing your mind with regards to our own lives, right? And things that you took for granted, you're like, oh, okay. Did
Yeah.
I pick my partner because of what her views are or because of what I eat?
Yeah, yeah. Well, your temperament there. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that just we could probably have another recorded conversation about cognition and affective states and all these things that go on in sort of, if you want to call us higher cognitive species, because we're very complex, I suppose. And yeah, but maybe that's part two. We can have you on for another conversation and speculate on some of what goes on there. But I do want to move back to where I was sort of prompting a moment ago. In your hologenomic environment and the work that you're doing, and then mainstream sort of science as it is, relating to genetics and maybe Darwinism and evolution and things like that. Can you share with us some of the feedback you've gotten from the I don't know if you want to call them mainstream community, but the people
Yeah.
who aren't doing hologenomics.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it varies and it has changed through time. I think when people really first started pushing the hologenome idea and the holobiont idea, holobionts are not controversial per se. People have known since the late 1800s that gut microbes are important for digesting food, and people have known since the early 1900s that certain organisms are symbionts, right, like a coral and so on, right?
Mm-hmm.
And actually, even a lot of work done in the 90s and so on about certain microbes in the gut of certain insects are important, right? Wolbachia, for example, in sexual reproduction. But I think what has become very interesting in the last 10, 15 years is how, not just how everything has got gut microbes, obviously, but how they have a huge effect on nearly everything. There's almost nothing where they don't have an effect, right? And so on the one hand, this has led people who've never factored them in, including myself, to think like, why are you overcomplicating that? We're quite happy going along looking at the genome. We don't need the microbiome bit, right? Or they will say, interesting, but it's so complicated. Can we really tease it apart anyway? And I mean, I have in the past written grants where I've said, for example, this is how we think domestication works, genome, nervous system. I reckon here's an alternate hypothesis. And I've had reviewers go like, why would you want to rock the boat? We know what's going on, right? I mean, it's just kind of closed to it. But as I said, I've had other reviewers say like, I don't think you could ever prove it. Or like, the past happened, we can never go back there. What I will say is that in the past 3, 4, 5 years, the acceptance is certainly increasing. And I actually started with a few colleagues a few years ago, a conference on what we call applied hologenomics and basically the application of hologenomic techniques to anything in biology. And it was a free conference. I had some funding from the EU. I got like 150 people the first time from all over the world. And we held it again this year, and we had 300 people plus several hundred online. And the interesting thing is that not only is the audience growing from diverse areas, right, but people are coming because they actually believe they can start applying it to their research. There were medical people there were plant production people there were fundamental evolutionary biologists, there were ecologists, right? So I think actually a lot of the resistance we faced is going simply because there is so much evidence coming out that actually you can do this stuff and it does have an effect. Now, that doesn't mean people will accept it. So even though I can show microbes affect behavior, that doesn't mean people will accept that, therefore we domesticate an animal through microbes, but at least they're not discounting it as an alternate route. And of course, our challenge is to show maybe it is the most likely route, right, as opposed to the standard. Um, but I will say, still, most people who do work in this area, even though it's growing, do believe there is some degree of hostility. But again, I think another reason is there has been some disputes over terminology, and it's kind of very nerdy stuff. But for
Hmm.
example, there was a debate early on. Seth Bordenstein, who's a really big name in holobiology, wrote a paper with Kevin Chase, and it basically said the holobiont might be under natural selection as a unit, and then lots of evolutionary theory people got very upset about this idea that the holobiont was under natural selection because it's two independent things, and that
Right.
led to a long series of arguments. But regardless of that fact, it doesn't change the fact the microbes are doing something. So
Yeah.
there might be argument about nerdy details.
Hmm. Hmm.
I want to put down the theory people here, but the reality is those microbes are doing some major stuff for the organisms, and this has major consequences, and you don't factor them in, you're never going to get the full picture. And again, the other thing I'd like to briefly mention, and this surprised me, I'm an evolutionary biologist. I was taught to believe we basic scientists are the visionaries, the open minds, right? And yet I was running up to these walls again and again, people saying, like, we know what's going on. Funnily enough, the people that first bought into what we were arguing was the applied people. We
Okay.
first got our funding from the salmon industry and the chicken industry, who I would imagine are the really close-minded people. But the reality is they have spent millions, if not billions of dollars trying
Yeah.
to improve the production of their animals by selecting on the genomes for improved growth and health. And they spent loads of money on microbiome supplements, and it's not been working out as planned, right? So
Mm.
when we come in and say, look, maybe you got to combine the two together, they're like, what's there to lose, right? I mean, we might as well
Right.
try.
Right. Yeah.
So I have a huge debt actually to these industrial people who were willing to try it because they'd seen the other stuff failing. They'd had the money to try it. Unlike the poor evolutionary biologists who never have money to try anything, right? So
Yeah. Hooray, market systems.
yeah, you can't fail if we can't test it.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, wow. Um, and where do trying to think of what to ask you next. I guess I had a question relating to when we talk about evolution, and so this might be a variation on the theme of niche construction. When we have our microbiome inside of us, I would assume that those microflora or bacteria or whatever are themselves coding differently based on their environment, based on constituency of
Yep.
nutrients and so forth. So is it a circuitous, you were talking about the controversy of, the holobiome does not evolve. There's two separate evolutionary things, but I almost see them being so interdependent to each other. And again, in a niche construction format
Uh,
that, they are obligates of our enteric system and sort of beholden to, or indebted to, or whatever to how we provide for them. And then again, there's that response that they give us that could influence us, maybe not directly transgenically, but certainly, maybe again in a neuroscience kind of way that then influences behavior and influences maybe very slowly how our genes change and evolve. So they're having perhaps an influence on us is a question. And
yeah.
also we, both by our system, the enteric system, is shaping them to an extent. Is that going on, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, just to clarify, the holobiont is clearly evolving. It might not be evolving under natural selection, which is like what the nerds are basically
Okay.
arguing over, right?
Okay.
But it's clearly co-evolving because, for example, again, if let's say we transition a vampire bat transitions to blood, it needs to change its genome to allow certain microbes to be in there, but they also need to evolve so they can live purely off the blood or so on, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
and they're actually then shaping the body itself to change the organs in the body to allow the right microbes to be there, right? So at one level, they're shaping each other that way over the long term. Then there are some examples of gene exchange anyway. I mean, there's at
Mm.
least one example from humans, for example, where I believe sequencing of people in Japan showed that in the genome of some Japanese people, they have certain genes that are derived from bacteria that are very good for digesting seaweed. So there is
Oh,
even, but it does get complex, and absolutely the actual state of the environment at any time has got a big effect, right? I mean, for example, vultures could have only evolved the ability to eat rotten carcass if there were conditions when the rotten carcasses would have been around to start with, right? If it had been like too cold and the carcasses were freeze drying, that would have never happened, for example, right?
yeah.
But what I think is important in our thinking is that there's a difference between the microbes that exist inside anything right at the moment versus the microbes that could exist inside something if they were given the chance, right? And this again comes a bit back to like ecology. If you think about, for example, a forest has some certain life forms in it, some trees and plants. More trees and plants and insects could probably live there than there are right now if they were introduced at the right time. But if there's already a forest there, they won't get in. If the weather's wrong, they won't get there, right? So the representation of what's there now is a subset of all the potential that could grow there. But again, if you've got a rainforest up in Seattle, you're not going to get saguaro cactuses growing up there ever. It's just too wrong, right? But you
Mm.
could have other things. Same with the microbiome. The microbiomes you have inside you now are the potential microbes that could be there. Other ones could also be there in the right situation, assuming the right environment was there, or the person was exposed to them, or the food was changed, or in fact that you didn't already have a community inside you. Because, and this actually gets onto interesting questions with regards to the probiotic industry, because
Mm.
if you are sold a probiotic and you take it, it is the idea you're dosing yourself with beneficial microbes that you need inside your body that will make you good, right? But that doesn't necessarily work, because if your body is already full of microbes, whether good or bad, that are filling up all the niches inside you, there's nowhere for the probiotic to establish itself. This may seem weird, but a very simple analogy I like to give is gardens. If you've got a garden full of grass and you want to grow wild flowers in it, if you throw some wild flower seed out, you'll be lucky if any of the flowers establish, because the grass is filling the niche, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you keep throwing it again and again and again and again and again, maybe they'll establish. But if you go and damage the garden, you
Mm.
rip up the grass, yes, that's going to work, right? And to be honest, probiotics are conceptually to be quite like that. If, yeah, you've got a damaged microbiome because you've taken antibiotics, sure, maybe they'll establish. But
Mm-hmm.
if you've got a healthy microbiome and it's just doing its stuff and all the niches are filled, there's no real reason why those probiotics should actually establish in it and just go straight through it. They need that ability. And so it's there's a reason why people suggest to be healthy, you should eat fermented foods. It's because if you keep eating fermented foods, you're throwing lots of diverse microbes inside yourself. You're keeping your inner microbiome nice and diverse, which is great because it produces lots of metabolites, but even better, it stops things you don't want getting in there.
Okay.
It's like a night, it's again, it's very similar to the problems of mass scale farming. I forget the term of it, but monoculture farming, right? The
Mm-hmm.
problem of this is you have one crop going everywhere. It's very easy to be invaded by other stuff because there are lots of unfilled niches, right? And the
Mm-hmm.
pathogens can get in. If you've got diverse range of crops together, there's very little niche space free. The invasives can't get in there, right? So it's basically ecology what's going on, right? But it does
Yeah.
raise questions about how effective are probiotics, or can they be made more effective?
Mm-hmm.
And another thing, to go back to what we started on, there is maybe a blind assumption that a probiotic will work equally well on every person or every animal,
Yeah.
right? But if you start to think about, do small differences in our genomes affect our relationship with microbes, that might not be the case, right? So maybe amazing Justin probiotic does super awesome stuff with you, but I take it and I'm just not genetically adapted to it. My immune system rejects it or so on, right?
Mm.
So, and again, this shouldn't be hugely controversial because we are right now in the era of personalized medicine. This idea that
Mm.
you can't give everyone the same drug because we react to drugs differently, right? We metabolize them differently. What are the probiotics doing if they get inside you? Making drugs.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, so it will be interesting, if not impossible, to at least consider, given that probiotics could be a good thing, would there be a way to maybe personalize them more, right? And if I can give you one more example, sorry for going on. maybe a really interesting area here could be fecal microbiome transplants, because
Hmm.
again, right now, very hot topic, the idea that you've got a messed up gut microflora. You take antibiotics and then you restock it with healthy fecal microflora. For those that don't know what it is, it's literally taking a capsule full of feces from a donor of good poo, right? Or an enema, right? And that's great. And it does work quite well, but not always. But would it work better if you were taking a transplant of your own feces or your family member's feces from when you were healthy? Because
Yeah.
that is the thing you're adapted to, right? That's the thing
Hmm.
you've grown up with. Should we all be biobanking when we're
Yeah.
at a young, healthy age?
Hmm.
Species, so that should we get in this awkward situation, instead of you taking mine or Jim from down the roads, right? You've got your own tailored ones. Probably it
Hmm.
would have a better effect because of the fact that your body and your microbes develop together as you're aging, right? Your
Hmm.
genotype is adapted to it. So, I can imagine there could be an interesting bank your own feces industry.
Yeah, that makes sense. And the other thing that as an intuitive, not educated person, I lean into prebiotics and sort of
Hmm.
give kind of things that I would
Yeah.
intuit that my microbiome would, be happy with, like a lot of cellulose fiber and things like that.
I think that's a much better approach, because then you're feeding what you already have, right? You're keeping the good stuff there. And that's also why if you have a crappy diet, it goes wrong. Because I mean, you're still getting prebiotics, it's just bad prebiotics, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah,
if you're
yeah.
like feeding them highly processed food, no matter how cheap and delicious it is, right? It's not got the fiber and stuff you need in there. So it is, I think, again, I'm not an expert on this, but intuitively to me, I think it's a better solution than probiotics, right? Like, keep what you've got good. It's like doing exercise to stay healthy. Do it while you can, as opposed to breaking your leg and then having to do it after because your bones were too weak, right?
Right,
It's
right.
yeah.
One question, staying in the enteric system for a moment, with our species, and I don't know if this is an urban legend or if this is something that science can back up, is that we have neuronal faculties, or we have neurons in our intestines. Do you think that's in part due to the relationship we have with microorganisms, or is this some other feature of adaptation and evolution that it just coincides, or are we relating to those neurochemicals that the
Yeah.
microbiome are releasing?
I think it has to be intertwined, because the gut is such an ancient evolutionary thing. And
Hmm.
when the gut started, the microbes came in, right? And I don't know what came first, nerves or guts, but given that many of the microbes produce very similar chemicals to what the body needs to produce anyway, serotonin, dopamine, right? Tryptophan, sorry, not tryptophan, glutamate, these
Tryptamines,
kind of
yeah.
things. It seems like they've got to be tied together, right? I mean, there's no reason why the microbes have only been producing metabolites in recent evolutionary time that affect the body, right? But also, it is the gut-brain axis. It is a bi-way communication thing, or even tri-way, some people call it, right?
Hmm.
So your body absolutely can affect your gut microbiome, right? By just everything changing, I guess, how fast your intestine pulsates, right? Or all sorts of things. Changing what you're pumping out from your body into the gut microbiome. So it is so tightly integrated that I can't imagine anywhere when they're not co-evolving together, right? I mean, but the gut itself had to co-evolve with microbes because the gut needs the microbes to digest the food. But then certainly the nervous system part of it has also got to be helping. Almost certainly as well, like all the other bits that are produced as well, by the enzymes being produced by the body or the pH of the stomach. Right? I think it's just so tightly entwined together.
Hmm. Yeah, it just seems to make sense. And sticking with our species again, in our formative years, perhaps before big diasporas out of Africa, I know there was a lecture that the anthropogeny series at the University of California has this one lecture that I absolutely adore. I think his name was Hutner, and he was talking about a moment of mutation in our system where something happened that our cortical folds increased, and it was basically an RGAP11A to a B conversion, and it actually lay dormant for almost a 500,000 years, but then it kicked in, and I almost wonder what kind of role. And there's no sort of provenance story to that. It was this random mutation, But I also, in any of these events of random mutation, I wonder, that holobiome system did not maybe help to facilitate that, especially again with the maybe, and this is really reaching out there in speculation world, but the cortical capacity, if we're having these neurotransmitters, like you said, norepinephrine, epinephrine, serotonin, dopamine, all these things going on, uh, I wonder if there was something change in diet or our transients led us to another location where there was a different type of thing going on that again we were eating things or something changed in our environment that may trigger these kind of so-called random mutations. So to speak to a question, do we credit random mutation with an engagement with these other quote unquote exogenous things that are
Yeah,
living in the holobiome?
I think so. I mean, the way evolution is generally viewed as working is that mutations happen, but unless there is a need for them, selection, nothing happens with it. So, very simple other example. I mean, the ability to drink milk, which is a
Mm,
weird trait in some humans because most animals stop it, isn't because the mutation to allow it is fairly recent. The mutation happened again and again and again through evolution, but at one point we domesticate cows and therefore it becomes useful and is selected on, right?
okay.
So almost certainly we will have mutations in our bodies. And if we're suddenly in a situation where a change in diet or a change in exposure to microbes leads to a change in the production of certain microbial metabolites, then it can make sense that actually selection will act on certain mutations that may have been dormant. And that could be explaining what's going on here, right?
Hmm.
So I think it's quite possible, right? But and then again, whether the human diet has changed sufficiently to allow that, I don't know. But let's go back again into paleoanthropology. One of the big transitions for humans is fire, right? We
Hmm. Yeah.
start cooking things. You fundamentally change what you can eat and also the content and how you can digest them.
Hmm.
That's going to have a big effect on the gut microbiome. Whether that has a knock-on effect, I don't know, but suddenly there's going to be a lot of different metabolites being produced, right? And maybe that does, on the one hand, just give you more energy, so maybe your brain can get bigger. Who knows, right?
Yeah.
On the other hand, maybe it's metabolites being produced that allow other things that weren't there before. I mean, it all ties together,
Hmm.
or could tie together. Again, that's the
Could.
fascinating thing. Might not
Right.
know it, but you can start thinking this way, and that's what's so fascinating. These alternate ways to lie awake at night or have conversations over a beer or whatever.
Yeah, yeah. No, it just gets my mind thinking before I met your work, I just accepted it as a random mutation and, very linear, straight, da, 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 da. But when I bring in what you guys are doing, it's like, oh, so there's a synchrony of things going on here and a complexity of processes that could influence or inform a change, and something random could just, we didn't include the possibility of something. So yeah, it's fascinating to think about. One thing I would like to maybe introduce some new things to our thinking here, and we'll just stay within our species for now, but this is obviously happening up and down the scale of the phylogenetic tree of living things. But uh, microphages and funguses, and all these other things outside of bacteria that we've been focusing on. They occupy our system, and for better or worse. I mean, so there are RNA viruses or things like that influence us. Other organs in our body, and bringing in new genera or new families. What are we looking at there? Are we looking? So are there things in our pancreas? Are there things maybe up in our head? I don't know. Yeah, that are influencing us, that are
Yeah.
that are affecting us.
I'm not a human biologist specialist,
Okay.
but
Okay.
but
Well, generally
absolutely.
speaking.
But generally, I mean, the microbiome is in a lot of places, right? And there are people talking about maybe there are microbes free floating in our blood that are not just pathogens, for example. And absolutely, there are infections like worm infections where you get it. You get some
Okay.
kind of worm that gets in the blood or gets in the brain or something. So you do get stuff inside you all the time.
Hmm.
There has been a lot of debate about it in things like the blood, mainly because of when people were trying to do the analyses, what's contamination and what's real, right? But the skin is covered in microbes, right? The genital organs are covered in microbes and so on. And they almost certainly have functions. They tend to get overlooked a bit because the connection of the gut to the nervous system is so great, but it doesn't mean they're not important. I mean, for
Hmm.
example, if you have bad eczema, could it be because you have some kind of microbiome imbalance on your skin, for example, right? One of my favorite ones I heard, and I heard it so long ago that I tend to forget now if this is based on published work or not, but it should be. It's such a good story. And it's actually about the fact that skin microbes under the armpits are apparently cleaving certain molecules our body produces, and the degradation product of them is actually very important for eliciting a sort of attractiveness response between humans, right?
Okay.
So so actually, it's not the hormones we produce, it's the degradation by the microbes. And the reason this is interesting is, again, it goes back to the more bigger picture thinking. If that's the case, how have we messed it up now that we shower and use deodorant, right?
Right.
We
Right.
spend all our time trying to clean under our armpits, right? Is that fundamentally changing human attraction? Is it
Mm.
that, if we'd gone back pre-World War II or whenever the last time was that people didn't have a lot of showers, would people have responded to each other on some kind of animal magnetism to use it based upon pheromonal responses?
Mhm.
That is completely lost now. In which case, are we finding an attractiveness based upon whole other things now? Maybe we are using more vision now or ideas or whatever. I mean, who knows? But the key point is those microbes are playing such a fundamental role on the skin in mate choice. I mean, that's got a huge determinant on how life works, right? And
Mhm.
many animals are interested in scents, right? Dogs love scents, and ant colonies recognize each other by so-called green beard genes, which is a recognition of certain chemicals that are produced by the bodies and stuff. I mean, it's just crazy when you think of these range of things they're in.
Yeah. Yeah. It's hard to go back to the, again, a very cut and dry narrative of adaptation and evolution when all these little influences, these little micro influences can add up. Again, especially, I don't want to give too much credit to our species, but we have metacognition and self-reflection. Like
Yeah.
you said, this could just move in to create some sort of unified choice making
Yeah.
algorithm or whatever. But yeah, it is really
Well,
fascinating to think about.
people do get upset when I talk too much about this, so I should put a caveat on that. I am not saying we don't have free will. I'm saying that
Yeah,
our
yeah.
thinking is conditioned potentially by the micro.
Hmm.
And maybe again, a simple example is there is evidence that if you eat a fiber-rich diet, you produce a lot of these short-chain fatty acids, and they're generally calming, right?
Hmm.
And actually, a logical extension of that is maybe we should all be vegetarians and eat lots of fibers, and then the world will be a calmer place and there won't be any problems, right? To
Kumbaya,
which,
yeah.
as I like to point out, Hitler's a good example against that because,
Yeah.
yeah, right?
Yeah.
But what I think you might be able to extrapolate from this is if we eat more fiber, does it put our body in a generally lower aroused state? So it's harder to get super angry or crazy, right?
Mm, mm.
Not that you can't get angry or crazy or violent, but it just takes more to get there, right? And so, are you just gently dampening the level, right? Or similarly, if you're eating something that's maybe got a positive effect on how happy you are, that doesn't mean you can't get super sad, but maybe you're more resistant to it, right? And so I think it's interesting in that regard that as a conditioner, not the same as a full-on driver, but people, I the other day gave a talk actually to some physicists who always think black and white clearly, and I
Right.
very much managed to upset one of them because he basically took what I was saying as, so you're basically saying that religion and this and free will has no say in it. I'm like, no, I'm not saying that at all.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is that this maybe conditions it, right? It's just part
Right.
of it, but it's an important part of the picture, and that's the super important thing. I mean, and this is very practical. I mean, I know very hot topic in the US, but also in the UK is the quality of cheap food, right? I mean, it sucks,
Uh-huh.
but cheap food is bad quality.
Right.
And it sucks in public in the state schools in England, the food that is provided is generally terrible quality, right? And people like Jamie Oliver, the famous chef, have been arguing for better quality for a long time. But maybe simply by spending money on better quality food, more fiber, more plants, you'll affect so much the behavior of the people in the classes, their default state, that the school will work better, right? And then there'll be less problems outside the school, and maybe you save money on policing and social workers and all these things
Yeah.
by feeding people
Cascade.
properly, right? I mean, it's almost like fundamentally giving people high quality food should be part of the state health system, essentially, which again, I realize in the US doesn't get on so well, but I live in socialist Denmark where we have it. But
Yeah.
you, if you mandated people to get the right foods and got them off these crappy ones, it would just be given the right prebiotics. It would just help
Hmm.
so many things. And it's not expensive if you think what you'll be saving later, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think it's really interesting stuff that people can think of. And I mean, I huge admiration for the food scientists and stuff working on the microbiome and the food and these kind of effects. And it's one of these things that just seems worth doing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like you said, it's a cascade effect, and a penny saved, or a penny spent here, saves you thousands of dollars down the line. Um, Alas, and it could be just as simple as putting, you know, rice bran or something into the junk food. Just
No, no,
start,
absolutely.
start there and move up. I'm ridiculous. I have psyllium and flaxseed and hemp fiber. I just load up every day, and I don't eat a lot of meat. And I try to stay away from crappy sugars and fast carbs and all that kind of stuff. And I'm still neurotic. I still got my stuff,
Yeah, I
but
mean,
I could be worse, right? I could be out on the street,
you
yelling
can
at
always
people.
be worse.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't want to preach, and I don't, but there's definitely a benefit of a balanced diet, right? And
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
think you need to only eat those things, but of course you do want to make sure you have some in there, right? And I
Yeah.
think that's the key thing. Like if you haven't got access or you can't afford vegetables or full fiber food, I mean, you're just hamstrung from the start. I mean, that's just the way
Hmm.
it comes down to, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, but yeah, as we said, I think maybe there could be huge savings for society in doing this correctly, right? In the long run. And
Hmm.
but having said that, there's another thing, if we have time, we can touch on it, which is then it gets ethically interesting.
Okay.
Because another thought experiment I like to bring up when I talk is let's assume what I'm saying is correct and vegetarian rich or fiber rich plant food is generally good for lowering the arousal state. Should we put more of it in prisons, right?
Mm,
To lower
mm.
the level of thing in there. But if we do that, and we're doing it because we know it's affecting the microbes and it's affecting the secondary metabolites, is that any different to drugging? I mean, is that any different to putting drugs in the water, right?
Yeah,
Because
benzos and stuff like that.
I mean, 'cause that's what we're doing. We're manipulating the metabolites produced, right? So
Yeah.
you get this interesting ethical gray zone, right? And of course, if it's with informed consent, it's one thing, but if you just did it, I mean, it's diet, right? How often do we just decide to change our kids' diet, but it's that different to it? You can have some interesting thoughts about it.
Well, when you think about it, imprisoned people, most of their civil liberties are taken from them. They're probably rules in prison, maybe. I don't. Thank goodness I've never been there, but I don't see where feeding them. Now I think the barrier to this especially in the States is budgets. You want us to spend how much, and we're not spoiling these, and it used to be that they were called reformatories or penitentiaries, where you were supposed to reform yourself. So I
Yeah.
almost see that as a good argument. It's probably cheaper than therapy. That you could hire a bunch of therapists to go in there and try to work with people who are struggling with sociopathy and psychopathy and things like that. But yeah, it would be an interesting. If anything, you could do experiments. I mean, there's plenty of imprisoned people, and you could have controls. You could have populations that are being treated in that regard.
You can, but again, the question is more informed consent. I mean, if you are doing it because you are thinking essentially it's having a drugging effect on the body, right? Does
Yeah.
it require informed consent? Because I'm pretty sure in the US you're not allowed to just put the drugs in the water, right? You
Right.
could if
Right.
you ask them. And and again, the other problem with this, of course, is even if you did it as a controlled study, there would be a huge placebo effect because if you tell them why you're doing it, I mean, it's pretty easy to tell when you're getting vegetables and when you're not, right? So you'd have to
Yeah.
control for that. But still, I mean, it's just my point is, I think they're interesting discussions people can start having when you realize the effect these have on mental state, but also just on physical health, right? I mean, all these other things like
Mm.
could we increase the health of people by encouraging more exercise, by giving them a diet that just produces more energy and gets the body flowing, right? I mean, if we know that activity in animals in controlled situations can be very much driven by the diet and the gut microbes, could it be that your people who struggle to get up in the morning could be a dietary thing? I mean, it's just I guess it comes back to my point. The more you think about the remarkable effect these microbes can have on the body, the more you can have these interesting ideas, right? But then the next step is how is this in turn being shaped by the genome, which goes back to our original holobiontic thing, right? So again, just because you might find a certain prebiotic or a certain probiotic has a great effect on you, can you then sell it to everybody saying it's the magic Justin effect, right? And do this?
Yeah.
Will it
Right.
work on everybody? Um, it's fascinating stuff, to be honest.
Hmm. Hmm. And I think we kind of see that in psychiatric medication and pharmacology that, somebody could have an SSRI or SNRI or something like that. And yeah, wonderful things happen. And other people are suddenly suicidal
That's the
because of that.
basis of personalized medicine. That's exactly it, right?
Right, right. And now is this something that's under the roof of your hologenomics project? Are you exploring these ideas of broader thinking about diet, nutrition, in the culture at large, or are you staying down at a level where you're
Yeah,
just sort of doing the nuts and
not
bolts and
officially.
okay.
I'm essentially I avoid humans because it's
Yeah.
I'm not a doctor. It's pretty hard to work with humans. This, but I do, give a lot talk, meet a lot of people. I bring it up because I do meet people who could do this, right? And I kind
Hmm.
of what I typically do is actually start from the interesting evolutionary stories. The vulture always works. People love hearing about vultures sticking up their head up the ends of the carcass, right?
Yeah, right.
But once you get them to accept in animals the range of effects it can have, it's much easier for people to take the jump to, oh, are we that much different?
Right,
And then it's
right.
much easier to get them thinking about these things, right? And again, people will often say to me, like, how could you ever prove this? How do you know there's any evidence for that? I'm saying, well, we take two mice, we put them in a cage, we see a big effect, right?
Right.
And because, so I tend to use that as a conversation to get it started. I mean, I'm just simply not qualified or skilled enough to do the human stuff, but I
Hmm.
will happily talk about it with people for a long time. And it is, as you say, testable kind of stuff, right? And it's again, it's one of these things that in the long run, I think could save money, right? And I mean, you can imagine a utopian world where you do have prisons, but the prisoners are growing vegetables and working in the kitchens, and
Yeah.
they're all calm because of that vegetable. I mean, yeah, don't get me wrong, this is not going to happen, right?
Right, right, right.
But having said that, it's I I I think the more people learn about what the microbes are doing and how it can affect the brain and how the health, the more interest they'll get in this, right? But it's just it's so important people view it as a intervention at the start as opposed to, oh, shit, let's fix things late, right? I mean,
Yeah.
people get fecal microbiome transplants because they've messed up their gut, either because of sickness or because they've been eating crappy food for like 30 years, right?
Right.
It'd be much better to just start on the fiber, right?
Yeah, 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 absolutely. Because like anything in science, you want to cut your number of steps and have simple explanations, and you just keep it simple. So
Yeah.
not that all science can do that, right? It's just if it's possible and convenient, you could do that. So when we're talking social science and what we can do as a psychosocial, psychocultural people in the collective and talking about these things, yeah, it's what's the least expensive in
Mm.
multiple ways, and how can we implement it ethically and see what we get, because like you said, it's better than all the drugs you have to develop. The in the States now there's a diabetic drug that costs a ton of money to help people lose weight,
Yeah, I
and
think that's the Danish made one. It's Wegovy. It's what
oh
funds my
yeah, I forget the name, but it's like, oh, I heard the price one time, I was like, oh my God, yeah.
it. No, I mean the large proportion of the Danish economy is based on that. It's Novo Nordisk Foundation, who are now the biggest
Okay,
foundation in the world. But
okay.
again, I mean, why are people taking it? And how much money would have been saved if society who's having to pay for those drugs had put it into, the good diets from the start and so on,
Yeah,
It's
yeah. And
classic.
again, the fecal inoculation and then pre-fiber or yeah, prebiotics, pre-fiber, that kind of stuff. It might take longer, but if it can reverse whatever it is you desire to reverse as a person who may be struggling with something, it just kind of makes sense to do that rather than taking a pill that and as I understand, once you stop taking the pill, that things will revert to some extent, so it's like you're just sort of you're dependent on that chemistry to keep things from getting worse.
Mm.
Whereas you can course correct. And again, I'm not trying to preach because we all have to make our choices. But yeah, it's tempting, I think, as something to explore and something to try to envision. But
I will happily finish this conversation and go to McDonald's for a cheeseburger. So I'm just
ah, like yeah, I'm no saint either. I eat some crappy food from time to time, but it's an exception rather than the rule. Because I'm in my mid 50s now, and I'm like, dude, you cannot live. You can't live like you did when you were younger. So you gotta be smart. So, well, speaking of bringing things to a finish, we've reached that hour point that we said we would consider stopping. But if there's anything else you want to add, or maybe something that you aspire for your project for the future, or some visioning, or any way you want to conclude this, let's go ahead and get a good closing statement from you that
Yeah, I mean, what I would hope is that actually people don't find what we're doing actually too controversial when they hear the details about it, right? And they realize that technology is changing, so it's possible to start addressing some of these questions. And so actually what we are now maybe calling a field of hologenomics actually ends up becoming a tool of hologenomics, right? We within the community have this idea that wouldn't it be awesome, instead of me holding every 2 years an applied hologenomics conference, you just go to the regular conference and it's just a load of talks within it that are using hologenomic methods, right? Just fully accepted within cardiology or whatever, evolutionary biology or whatever. And so that's really our aim, right? Our aim is actually to drive ourselves extinct as a field and just turn ourselves into a technology where people just embrace life work in this way, no matter what they're working on. And, myself and other colleagues, we're optimistic it's getting that way because I think there's more and more evidence coming up, but we'll see.
Yeah. And in a sense, it's an abstracted holobiont process because you're incorporating yourself into disciplines that exist already, and then you can have that symbiont relationship. So it would only make sense, and it would be very fitting that would happen. So well, I will continue to watch and follow what you guys are doing, and it sounds weird to say that I would encourage you to fade into the background, but yeah, because then you'll have to go figure out something else to do, and you're young, so. But
There's
anyway,
always something else.
there's a win for that, there's definitely a win. And Tom, I very much appreciate you again coming in and opening this up for us, and to the YouTube audience, I will make sure I have information for everything you need to learn more about Tom's work and all of his colleagues and so forth. But again, Tom, thank you so much for this conversation. I appreciate it. I'd love to have you back sometime. Maybe we can work up some other ideas to talk
Anytime.
about.
And if your audience are interested, my center does have a YouTube channel where a lot of the people who give talks, when they come to visit us, their videos are put up there that they might find quite interesting because it's kind of very different applications of it. So
yeah, it's very diverse. It's very diverse. And I will make sure that links down below. And I want to see subscribership go up there. Get you guys some new subscribers. I don't have a lot myself, but if any of my folks that subscribe to me would migrate over, that would be neat. So, okay, Tom, thank you again. I'll say goodbye to you after I stop the record button. To the YouTube audience, thank you for your time and attention. And hopefully there were good takeaways for you. And you can continue your journey again in the description field with the links that I provide. Thank you.